Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you all joining us from around the world. I'm Yasmin Batliwala, the Chief Executive of Advocates for International Development. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all to A4ID's first webinar of the year and the first in our new series, Justice Through Partnership, Unlocking Legal Support for Development Impact. Today's session, How to Harness the Power of Law for Development, it's not just timely, it's urgent. We meet at a moment of deep complexity for our sector. The world is changing faster than many of us can process. The convergence of crises, such as shifting aid policies, democratic backsliding, climate emergencies, geopolitical instability, has created, if you like, a perfect storm that threatens to leave the world's most marginalized communities further behind than ever before. Many of you will know firsthand that pressures this creates, the widespread suspension of USaid funding has already triggered a crisis across NGOs and humanitarian agencies. Services are being halted. Programs are closing. Dedicated staff are losing their jobs. And yet, as always, the needs of communities do not diminish. In fact, they grow. This is happening across the backdrop of multiple conflicts in Gaza, in Sudan, in Ukraine, in Syria, which continue to devastate populations and demand huge humanitarian response efforts. The sector is being asked to do more with less. And on top of this, we face structural challenges, the accelerating impacts of climate change, rising inequality, and a global financial system that too often keeps the poorest locked out of opportunity. For some organizations, these changes are simply inconvenient. For others, they are existential. They raise profound questions. Can we still deliver on our mission? Can we survive at all? And if we don't survive, what happens to our work, to our legacy, to the people we serve? It is in this difficult context that today's conversation takes on its full meaning. Because while these pressures are daunting, they also call us to be bold, to innovate, to collaborate, and to find new ways of delivering impact. And this is where the law and legal partnerships come in. Too often, legal support is thought of as a back office function, there to keep organizations compliant and out of trouble. Today, I want to challenge that view, because what we're seeing through A4ID's work is something very different. Pro bono lawyers becoming not just problem solvers, but enablers of transformation. Consider just some of the ways pro bono lawyers are supporting NGOs and development actors right now. Pro bono lawyers are establishing new entities in new jurisdictions so organizations can access funding that would otherwise be out of reach. Pro bono lawyers are restructuring internally to meet complex new eligibility criteria set by donors and funders. Pro bono lawyers are navigating across borders with legal frameworks to ensure funding can flow from source to operations. Pro bono lawyers are designing profit-generating arms to help organizations blend non-profit missions with sustainable revenue generation. Pro bono lawyers are renegotiating contracts to reduce overheads and to improve efficiency. And finally, pro bono lawyers are also reconfiguring operations so that scarce resources can be focused where they're needed most. In each of these examples, legal support is not a cost center. It is a driver. It's a driver of resilience, of creativity, and of survival. This is why today's discussion is so important. It's about recognizing that the law is a tool for development, a powerful one at that, and asking how we can unlock its full potential for those who need it most. I'm therefore delighted to say that for this discussion, we've brought together an outstanding panel of experts. They will share what they are seeing across the sector, how organizations are adapting, the devastating effects resulting, and crucially, how pro bono lawyers can continue to be part of the solution. So as we begin, I invite you to approach this conversation with both realism and optimism. Realism about the scale of the challenges before us, but optimism that together, through partnership, we can create new pathways forward. Because if there is one thing we know at A4ID, it is this: when legal and development sectors come together, we unlock something powerful, not just the means to survive crises, but the possibility of building a more just and a more equitable world. So now, I'm delighted to introduce our moderator for the session, Constantin Fladerer-Burgess, who's head of legal at REEEP, which stands for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency Partnership, and is based in Vienna. Thank you, welcome, and over to you, Constantin.
Thank you, Yasmin, and for the great introduction on this really relevant topic. And welcome and thank you also to everyone who is here with us today on this in this webinar. My name is Constantin, as you've heard. I work for the Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency Partnership, in short, REEEP with 3 E's, and I will moderate this discussion. And to start, basically, let me give you a short overview of the, how the conversation will flow. I will start with introducing the panel, and afterwards we will very much reflect basically what Yasmin just said, this two-pronged situation on realism and optimism that we find ourselves in at the moment. So we will first talk about the challenges that our organizations are facing at the moment, and there are plenty of them. But secondly, we will also talk about how to mitigate these challenges, especially from a legal perspective, and what we as legal practitioners, with the support also, especially of pro bono lawyers, can achieve. And at the end of this webinar, there will also be some room for questions, and we have reserved about 15 minutes for this. All right, before I start introducing you to the really fantastic people who are here with me today on this panel, briefly on myself at REEEP. As I said in the beginning, my name is Constantin, and it seems as I'm the only panelist today whose name does not start with a J. At REEEP, we are a non-profit public-private partnership registered in Austria, and our mission is to advance the development of markets for clean energy and energy efficiency in countries of the global south. So in short, we really sit at this intersection of clean energy at the one hand and of development cooperation on the other hand. That's it basically on me and on REEEP. And I'm absolutely delighted to have here with me first Jean Scrimgeour from the Accountability Lab. Jean, over to you.
Morning all, my name is Jean and I'm co-CEO of Accountability Lab Global, based in Washington, DC, currently in New York for UNGA. I mainly focus on sort of operations and innovation and sort of how we're, particularly in this case, how we had to pivot and figure out new ways of working and managing our budgets.
Thank you, Jean. Great to have you with us. Next on the panel, we have Jim Fitzgerald from the Equal Rights Trust. Over to you, Jim.
Thanks, Constantine. Thanks also to Yasmin and to A4ID for convening this panel. As you said, I'm director of the Equal Rights Trust. We're an international NGO based in London, but working globally. We work in partnership primarily with civil society organisations to support the development, adoption, implementation and use of equality laws. We use the term equality laws to refer to comprehensive anti-discrimination laws, that is, laws which prohibit discrimination on all grounds, in all areas of life, and prohibiting all forms of discrimination. We do that work in partnership with civil society, with academia, with the legal profession, and with intergovernmental organisations like the United Nations. I'm delighted to be here, and thanks very much again.
Thank you, Jim. Great to have you. And last but not least, James Aiken, representing the Advocates for International Development team. Thanks not only for being here with us, but also for organizing this event. Yeah, over to you, James.
Thank you, Constantin. So I'm the lead of the Pro Bono Legal Services team here at A4ID. So our focus is to advance the UN SDGs, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and in doing advance not only international development, but also the humanitarian work and the human rights work, which is wrapped up in that. We work with our broad network of NGOs to kind of identify their unmet needs, whether the ones they're aware of or not aware of, and then find lawyers who can provide that assistance, the legal assistance, on a pro bono basis. The benefit of that is that we have a really broad network, which gives me a view over how I think literally thousands of NGOs are working, and especially how people are being affected and responding to this situation.
Thank you, James. And on a personal note, I can also say, having worked with James for a couple of years now, that we've really received great support on various topics over the last years from your network. That's it on the panel. I would suggest we just start diving into the challenges that our organizations are facing at the moment. And on that, I'd like to hand over to you, Jim, first. And maybe you can just give us a short overview of what kind of challenges your organization is facing at the moment.
Thanks, Constantin. So, I mean, when I think about this problem of what is the challenge that the international development sector as a whole, and my part of the international development sector in particular, is facing in 2025, I think the first point I would make is it matters, I think, which subsection of the overall sector one is in. So my organization, we're in the human rights part of the third sector, and in particular, as I mentioned, our focus is on the protection of groups exposed to discrimination, so the most marginalized members of different societies. And because we're an organization that works on equality holistically, and because we do that internationally, we work with actors who are working with and on behalf of all sorts of different marginalized communities in different parts of the world. And I think that gives me a bit of a privileged insight and overview of the challenges we face. My view, which is partly personal and anecdotal, but partly based on the emerging, and I stress that, emerging data on the impact, is that our part of the wider third sector is experiencing the current funding crisis more acutely than any other. And I think our subsector is facing what I would see as what I think you can call a triple threat, which includes but goes beyond the very widely known and well publicized impact of the USaid cutbacks. So what are the three prongs of that triple threat? First, there's the USaid cuts themselves and the corresponding cutbacks by the UK and by Germany and other development funders. Data published just a couple of weeks ago from the Human Rights Funders Network indicates that overall cuts in ODA funding, so that includes USaid, but other foreign aid funding from state aid budgets, will result in human rights funding from that ODA pot reducing by $1.9 billion. Now that's, in financial terms, only a small fraction of that overall ODA funding reduction, but in proportionate terms, it's really large. So that's 30% of the foreign aid funding going towards human rights that is projected to disappear between 2023 and the end of next year. That's a huge cutback in that state aid part of the funding landscape. The second impact is that the ODA reductions have had a knock-on impact on another major source of support for our sector, which is private philanthropy, human rights focused foundations and trusts. Again, according to data from the Human Rights Funders Network, foundations provide approximately $5 billion USD per annum to human rights action worldwide. Reductions in ODA funding and what you might call the chilling effect has had a number of impacts on that private philanthropy sector. We've seen some funders redirect funds to step into the breach, as it were, to try and backfill where funding has been cut from programs that are focused on the rights of marginalized communities that were being funded by USAID or others that are no longer going to be funded. We've seen some funders reduce their funding in order to respond to or take pause or understand how to respond to the latest crisis. And we've seen others pause or delay or put on hold funding programs. And all of that, obviously, that might be a result of a wider strategic review by those private philanthropists, but it has an immediate impact on organizations on the ground that might, on the one hand, lose funding from USAID or other state aid, and then find that their other sources of funding are also being cut back, maybe only paused, but a pause is, and has an immediate impact on cash flow. And then the third impact is the political one. In the US in particular, but also I think you can see this in the UK and in other European spaces, the rise of exclusionary narratives in domestic politics means that certain funders, whether that's private philanthropists, whether that's individuals putting their own hand in their pockets, or whether that's corporate donors, there's a chilling effect. People are less willing, corporations in particular are less willing to be seen to support certain communities. And we see this particularly with the phrase DEI, which was the specific focus of executive orders alongside the USAID orders. So we've seen a very particular impact on the human rights sector and in particular on the equality rights sector as a result of that wider political narrative that goes alongside the funding cuts. So you've got this triple threat: direct loss of ODA funding, reduction in or redirection in philanthropic funding, and then a chilling effect on corporate and individual donations. And this all comes at a time when some key human rights funders were already closing or redirecting to address other challenges. So Wellspring Advisors announced earlier this year that it was redirecting its funding towards environmental action and away from human rights. The Open Society Foundation is still in the midst of an ongoing restructure and strategic review process. And all of the evidence that we have, and I stress again that this is emerging evidence, is that those who are most affected are organizations working with the most stigmatized, the most marginalized groups. And these groups are already working within severe funding constraints. Unlike other parts of the third sector, other forms of funding, corporate funding, for example, or funding from domestic giving, much more difficult to access if you're talking about deeply stigmatized or in some cases illegal people whose very existence is criminalized. Very, very difficult for those organizations to access that kind of funding. So why am I here to say this rather than a frontline organization or a human rights funder? Because my organization, the Equal Rights Trust, has been at the sharp end of this wave of funding reduction. So earlier this year, we reached the decision to wind down our organization, and we'll actually be officially closing or ceasing activities at the end of September, and then entering a period of winding down with a view to closing in the next few months. Now, our organization has always been, it's always been difficult to fund the work that we do. We work behind the scenes. We focus on long-term system level impact. We promote change through the law. We bring together rather than work within a specific equality movement. And all of that means that funding our work has been more difficult. But in the face of this cataclysm level event in terms of funding for the sector, it became clear to us that what was once challenging had simply become impossible, and that we couldn't fund our work without compromising our mission and values. So the decision that we took was to act early was to get ahead of this problem and to initiate the closure of the organization so that we could do this in an orderly manner, so that we could focus on how to share our resources, safeguard our legacy, and support others to take parts of our mission forward. Now, if all of this sounds depressing, and I stress again, I think there really are reasons for alarm, I think it is important that there are, to note that there are signs of hope as well. So in our sector, there are growing signs of support for the kind of comprehensive, inclusive approach to equality that we have long promoted. We've got partners. Just this morning, I was speaking to a partner organization in Indonesia, which is really pressing ahead with law reform work that would have been unthinkable 5 years ago. So there is reason for deep concern regarding the funding crisis, but there are also at the national level, at the domestic level, in countries like Indonesia, but also in Japan, in Brazil, all over the world, there are movements which are burgeoning and growing in strength and are really building support for really essential law reform. So there is a grave challenge, but there is also reason for optimism. And I think the key for me is this all now needs an immediate response. This is a moment where the gains of in some cases years and decades of progressive work is at risk unless urgent action is taken to underpin the sector and find new sources of funding and new ways forward in light of a reducing resource environment. Thanks very much.
Thanks for these insights, Jim, and sorry that particularly your part of the third sector is affected so much. I 100% agree that all of this requires immediate actions, and we'll certainly touch on this later. But before we do so, over to you, Jean, and the challenges that you see basically in your daily work.
Sure. So just sort of a bit of quick background before I go into a little bit of a different to a little bit more about my organization. We on the 24th of January, when we found out that all the cuts were coming, it was a Friday night, and we were like, oh, this isn't really going to be real. For us, it was about $4.7 million worth of money over the next 3-4 years. But at the same time, given that we'd known how crazy a lot of the EOs, the executive orders were, and that actually many of the courts were upholding them, we thought, okay, we probably need to make a bit of a plan in case this is real and in case this is going to be something that we're going to need to think about more seriously. No one has ever experienced this before. We didn't even know whether or not it was legal. And so over that weekend, we started calling up all our community. We work in the accountability, transparency, integrity space. It is not a very large community, but the broader ecosystem, touches on a lot of things. It touches on human rights and climate and education and social services. So our community, sort of while we were just chatting to our immediate friends to see what they had heard and how one would navigate this, we started getting a lot of input from the broader community who was saying, well, we don't know what this means for us either. We don't know what this looks like. And so on that first Monday morning, we had called up one or two of our donors to say, have you seen this and what do we do? And they said, listen, we have no idea because we actually have never asked our community how much US government funding they have. So we don't know how big this is. Could you guys do a quick data collection, sort of thing, just snap data collection, see what this means? This sort of snap data collection, the first data collection process finished on 4 days later, and the numbers were overwhelming. We've since done a few more of these data collection processes, and I'm going to show you a little bit of the results here, because I think that the numbers, as Jim said, are really sobering and something that I think puts some of what is going on into more context. So there we go, if everyone can see my screen. So this was sort of one of the last data collection exercise we did was in May. And so these are results from there. May, June. There's going to be another one coming out now, so please do if you want to participate. Just a plug for that. We've also partnered with a few other organizations, larger organizations who are also doing data collection, so we can try and aggregate as much as we can. But I think some of the very sobering things are 21% of our community said that they had no more, that they had a month left. 16 said less than more than 6 months, but 24 said up to 3. And I think essentially this is sort of saying that more than 50% of our community is saying we're not going to live past 3 months. And we're now hitting that 3-month mark, and a lot of these this has actually come to fruition. At the time, 50% of organizations had said that they had furloughed staff. 14 had said that they hadn't yet, but they were going to do so in the coming weeks and months. This is sort of looking at organizations that have decided to close one or more offices, organizations that have decided to entirely close, or organizations that have decided to actively consider restructuring or merging. And I think for many, the first sort of plan was, okay, let's see if we can downsize a little. But what we found is that actually many organizations, the downsizing wasn't enough. And I think that these numbers to me are incredibly sort of sobering too, because this essentially says 60% of organizations were going to become much smaller. The second one is sort of, while less organizations have decided to close 4 or 5 months ago, those numbers are now going to be very different. And I think that there's going to be a conglomeration between that sort of point 1 and point 2 here. And so, we are now also in a space where our community, I don't think has necessarily ever really thought as deeply as it is now about restructuring, merging, or in Jim's case, doing good closing. Making sure that our information is left behind in good hands. I think just to quickly, note health, governance, education, human rights are sort of some of the big ones that are most affected. Where organizations are based. A lot of this is based on where our initial data collection happened. I think the other thing that we need to be clear on here is that for our community, the USaid cuts were the most impactful right now. But I think the downstream is enormous. Many organizations who think that they're not affected by USaid cuts because they don't receive US government money are now being really badly affected, as Jim said, by philanthropic redirection. They're being really badly affected by maybe they were a service provider of an organization that was receiving money from USaid. Now they're not getting that money anymore. And I think that this, and I think that this is a very good reflection of actually even what happened in 2008 with the financial crisis. In the first sort of bastion were like the US, the UK, but later on, 18 months time, this slide changed significantly. And sort of it then became those that are most affected were other large, other sort of downstream countries. And I think that this is something that we need to watch for, because while we may bounce back or change or, reshape ourselves, it's actually our beneficiaries and those of us that we work with that are going to be most affected within the next 12 to 18 months. And I think that when the whiplash for ourselves is over, that's when the others are going to need the most support. And we really have to think about how we can do that well. And actually, because there is a very, very real risk that for many of our sectors and ecosystems, that there could be a complete collapse or failure. And as Jim was saying with the human rights community, if there is a collapse of the human rights ecosystem, sort of the human rights defense ecosystem, that's not something that you just pick up next year. You know, you don't just sort of throw $10 million at it and it will quickly come back. These sorts of things take many, many years. I think just from the lab side, ourselves, I think we've also had to we've had to contract somewhat. We're a translocal network, so we're a network of independent nonprofits that sort of work together, and those of our labs that were wholly dependent on US government
Jean just froze on my screen. Is that the same for the others?
Yes, same for me.
Yeah, afraid so.
Yeah, maybe before until we have Jean back with us, I can continue the conversation, and I'll keep my part short because we are already a bit behind with our agenda. I can just, basically agree with what you, Jim and Jean, have said on the cuts. We at REEEP were also affected very much. 30% of our budget was dependent on USaid, but also on the downstream level, as we've heard from Jean. We work with a lot of implementing partners, around 150 consultants that work on 200 projects in the countries of the Global South that we work in. So, of course, they were also affected by these cuts. So the damage to the ecosystems is huge, I would say. Other than on the cut, sorry, Jean, I see you're back with us.
Sorry, my internet dropped. But anyway, what I was just going to say is, you know, as we continue with the conversation, I'm going to chat a little bit more about what some of the community is doing and some of the things that we, you know, some of the mitigating factors and how our legal friends can help.
Thank you, Jean. Yeah, and while we were waiting for you to come back, just basically you said that the network that we work with has been directly affected as a consequence of us being affected. So I really fully agree with what you have just said. Maybe some aspects that have not been mentioned yet. Let me focus on those. In the clean energy and also development cooperation sector, it's not only shortcuts, but what we are also seeing is that the funding streams just work differently. In the past, but this is now, you know, further back in the past, it was really the case that funding for clean energy projects, for development projects, usually was, you know, in the form of direct grants from governments to either other governments or projects. And we see now a huge shift in these streams. We see now that first, smaller organizations, smaller projects are not really supported that much anymore because this relates to the risk aversity of governments. They want to make secure investments, basically. They pool money in larger trusts, like the project Mission 300 by the World Bank and the African Development Bank, for instance. And on the legal side, these new funding streams, first, different type of funding, but also pooling in more private sector money together, sometimes with public sector money, comes with its own legal challenges. We at REEEP are a non-profit organization under Austrian law, so we have charitable status. It's a bit different from a charitability status in the UK or US, but it is similar. But it essentially also means that for us, it's not so easy to work with private sector money. So what we are seeing is that governments don't want to put, you know, 100% public money on the table anymore, but they want to, basically have the private sector participate in leading to market changes, which is something that we very much encourage. But legally speaking, the implementation of these new ideas, new funding streams is a bit challenging. But we can talk about this in a bit when we talk about how to address these challenges. With that, I hand over to you, James. Maybe you can also keep your presentation short in the interest of time.
Absolutely. Well, I'd say, again, so much has been covered already that I most of what I'd say would be agreeing with it in terms of not only the impact of USAID on the downstream services, but also I think it's important to note the chilling effect and the shift in kind of public approach to this, public in this case, as you say, including kind of corporations and private companies. And there's been a lot of either reduction or redirection of how they're using resources that previously went to CSR, to impact investing and things like that. I think the only other one I would raise that has been particularly relevant through our work is the unpredictability of it. As you say, like so much of this has come through executive orders, which are dropped at a moment's notice. And then also some of the shifts in the chilling effect and the shifts in funder mindsets isn't what we thought was going to be happening over the next few years, this kind of cutting back and these changes. And we've seen that most with when some of our development partner clients come to us and they're looking for lawyers to help them navigate this water. They want clear advice over what can be done next. And it is pretty impossible to give a clear answer about what's going to happen next because we are in uncharted waters, because they can put together a plan and then an executive order drops and just changes all kinds of things. So yeah, I agree with absolutely everything that's been said. And the only thing I could add is the unprecedented nature of the times we're in and how difficult that makes it to respond and predict.
Thank you, James. This again 100% agree. Thank you. With that, I would suggest we move on to the more hopeful part of the webinar and also the more legal part when we talk about how we can mitigate these challenges. Just want to remind the audience at this point that you can ask questions in the chat, so just feel free to post any questions. And the Advocates for International Development team will pick those up and will then at the end of this webinar have the opportunity to address your questions. Before we do that though, firstly, let me ask some questions to my co-panelists, and I invite you to just raise your hands and then answer each question. Yeah, and the first one would be, we've heard also from you, James, about the uncertainty, legal uncertainty, financial uncertainty, political uncertainty. So we see that we are very much in the middle of this challenge. It's not something from the past, it's not something from the future. We are just really in the middle of these changes are happening everywhere. And what I would like to discuss first is direct legal challenges to these challenges that our sector is facing. And what would you say are the steps that NGOs could take in this space at this very moment? Yeah, James?
I could start on this one very, very briefly. Yeah, it is very difficult. I know that in terms of the overall issue of the USaid cuts, there was a law firm called Nichols Liu who were looking at bringing litigation about that in the US, and I think a few others were as well. And it was another situation where we kind of went into an unprecedented position because I think the chilling effect hit that litigation almost immediately. It was the fact that in a very what would be the term, a hostile environment in which NGOs and nonprofits were functioning, it was a big deal to sign up to this litigation, to bring this challenge. And obviously the power of the US government is very difficult to bring a case against. But that's then happening all across the board in terms of if funders start pulling back their funding, you have to look at what's in the contract, what were you promised and what's in place, and how much are they breaching that by withdrawing it. I think a big issue for all of this in terms of trying to bring direct legal challenges and litigate against either the government or private funders for withdrawing the funding is the inequality of arms involved in all of that. If you are an NGO, you're going up against a government or a private fund, that's a big issue. And so I think that first of all, it's a section where pro bono assistance can be vital because getting the kind of legal team on your side who we can have in our illegal network is a huge boon to one of those cases. But you've also got to deal with the fact that a lot of US firms are stepping back from the level of pro bono they're doing because of the conflicts they're going to have there with the government, especially with the agreements that people have been signing recently. And so it has to be very strategic. You have to decide which claim is worth bringing, which claim is going to be useful in the right direction, and probably try to compile as much assistance from other organizations as you can for that. So that would be my brief overview on the legal challenges.
Yes, Jean?
I think that now is the time for civil society and nonprofits to work together. This isn't the time, I think the entire intention here is to make us compete with each other, shout at each other, figure out how to have big elbows, compete for money, snitch on each other, and who is now not a time. Now time for us together. These are intensely complicated issues. We don't actually understand how a lot of these work. A lot of the legal, the courts are, what they're doing essentially, they're pushing it to the Supreme Court, saying we don't know if thing, but we're going to let it happen until we can discuss this issue on the merits. And those are very concerning. And so what we should be doing, and what we do need to do, really importantly, is we need to be able to work together. We need to be able to pool our resources. We need to be able to share information with each other, so that law firms are not spending enormous amounts of money, litigating the same thing over and over again. I mean, that's what the courts have asked us to do. They've essentially said, if you're going to go and do this, if you want to challenge us, you have to challenge us one at a time. And what we need to do is be able to say, okay, if we have to challenge you one at a time, we can do that. But we need to be able to copy the information. We need to have some copy and paste. We need law firms to talk to each other. We need to talk to each other. We need to be able to share briefs, because wasting time, whether it be pro bono, low bono, or full price cost of lawyers, is just bogging us down, draining the very few resources that we have, whether they be financial or human. And they're essentially even more easily making the administration and those that would like to stop us doing what we're doing, making it easier for them to do so. I think, and I mean, and I think that this goes beyond. I think this is to deal with the US government problem in particular. I think that there's a lot that we can learn from many countries that have been through this sort of transition. And I think we need partners in places like Zimbabwe and other countries that have experienced these sorts of issues, to say, how did you manage this? How did you build these collective action programs and processes? How did you make use of the legal services that were available to you? So that we're not just, as I said, one at a time, calling up our lawyer colleagues, and not really getting to the big issues, which is how do we sort of stop some of these big problems that are going to stop us working.
Thank you, Jim. Yeah, James.
I completely agree with that. In terms of the collaboration is really key here. I think that the only other thing I'd add, because it's something you raised there, is that this is not only something that's happened in the US, it has happened elsewhere. And what we've found in some other jurisdictions is, especially where governments are a little more hostile to NGOs, they find other ways to make their lives difficult. So if there isn't legislation in place to shut down NGO, then instead there'll be a sudden audit, or they'll pick on some particular point. And I think one area that can be helpful in that is, and this is a thing that pro bono lawyers can help with, is ensuring compliance. I think it's the idea of, if you're going into litigation, you make sure your defense is as strong as possible beforehand. And I think it's the same idea with this. So yeah, I think for NGOs gathering together and ready to take one of these cases forwards, it's important to shore up your defenses beforehand, and then make sure that there's not a kind of backhanded route for the other side to take.
No, absolutely. And from our experience also, I think there's really a relevant role for the legal practitioners, be it in-house or external support, in getting your defense up early enough, but also just analyzing funding agreements that are being terminated. The funding agreements that we have had with USaid, they are quite complex agreements, especially if you're not based in the US. If you're not familiar with the US jurisdiction, then you have huge funding contracts that you need to analyze and kind of make work for a small Austrian NGO, essentially. So there is definitely a role for legal practitioners in there and for legal support, of course. If you don't have anything to add here, Jim, but feel free to, if you want to say something, I'd move on to the next question, which looks more on the income side of things. We've heard a lot about funding cuts. So one thing that NGOs can do is, of course, look at accessing other types of funding. And there I'd like to kickstart the conversation with 3 takeaways from REEEP from our perspective. We've heard from Yasmin in the introductory remarks that jurisdictional flexibility is one way to mitigate these challenges. So if funding in one particular country is difficult, channeling funding through vehicles in other countries might be an option, or even might be seen favorable in terms of, from the political side of things. And these are obviously also quite complex legal things to do, setting up part of your business not in your home jurisdiction. We at REEEP have decided 2 years ago to set up a vehicle in the UK to access more private money, basically more investment type of money in the clean energy sector, especially because of the very restrictive Austrian legal tax regime. Of course, now in the meantime, FCDO has also cut its funding, so this choice of jurisdiction maybe in hindsight was not the perfect one, but at least we are quite happy with the UK as being a very flexible and agile jurisdiction. So this is definitely something that organizations can consider. Second, I've already stressed this point, more inclusion of the private sector and shaping out new instruments that how you can implement your projects. One instrument I want to mention here is basically guarantees, credit guarantees. What we are doing in one of our projects is that we use money from the public donor to provide a first loss credit guarantee mechanism to financial institutions, which works in a way that a financial institution, a bank or microfinancing institution, lends money to SMEs who would otherwise not have had access to this money so that they can develop their business. And then if there's a default of these loans, then the government money comes in and basically covers the loss of the financial institution. And this is, for instance, one instrument that, in our view, shares the risk between the financial institutions and the government, because the government, usually it's not 100% coverage, but let's say 50% coverage. So it's less risky for them, but also for the financial institutions to lend. And the third point I want to mention very briefly is a slight shift of purpose. Of course, in our sector, we are all very much behind what we are doing. So I'm not suggesting that organizations should change their mission and vision statements. But an example from our work, for instance, we see that the focus of the public sector is still very much on food security. So what we are now trying to focus on is clean energy, so productive use of clean energy in the agricultural sector. So this is, in our view, we are still doing the same thing, but we present it slightly differently. Yes, Jim.
Thanks, Constantin. I mean, those sound, like you're pursuing some very creative and proactive responses to the challenge. And it sounds like you will have some success. I have to say, this is, I think, where the sectoral differences arise. I don't think for most equality or human rights actors, jurisdictional change is not really an option other than for the relatively small number of NGOs in the sector. The majority of organizations working in this field are domestic, and so obviously they're domiciled in the jurisdiction in which they're advocating, which means that they're more exposed to the kind of repressive state legislation that James was talking about. And I think there has been, I mean, I think it's one of the, I guess, what would it be, the third ripple effect from the USAID cuts and the executive orders. There has been a significant move away from EDI funding and corporate social responsibility funding and corporate sustainability investment, which skews again very heavily away from anything to do with equality, marginalized groups, human rights, whatever it might be. So I think it's really, really important that all avenues are investigated and pursued, but I do think we need to be mindful of the fact that these things hit different in different parts of the sector, and some of these avenues may not be available for certain parts of the sector. I think there are other things that you know our part of the sector can do, but some of these options are simply not available for some actors.
Thanks, Jim. That's a very valid point, of course. Yeah. James, yeah.
I guess just, yeah, one other point I check in, and this again is one which depends entirely on the organization and the sector you're in. But one response we've seen some people making is setting up a for-profit arm of their company to kind of funnel the funds to their non-profit. That comes with a lot of compliance issues itself, and obviously there's a lot of legal aspects around that. But the one thing I think it is useful in showing is the market value of the skills and resources involved. I think this has obviously been pushed much further by the growth of ESG and ESG investment over the last 10 years. And that's obviously itself coming into a difficult time now with pulls in other directions, especially with the anti-DEI stuff in America. But the fact is that if you are looking at building sustainability in terms of your environmental impact and your impact on the community you work with, including workers, then NGOs are the experts in that. That's where these people have been spending years building their expertise and knowledge, and they know more about it than the people in corporations do. And so I've seen some NGOs start acting as consultants to teach the larger corporations, these are the steps you need to be aware of, this is what you need to be doing, and then charging their time for that because there is market value in that. And as I said, it's a limited option and only for in some places, but I have seen it work effectively.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, James. Yeah, and I do agree that not all of the funding shortcuts can be filled with private sector money. This is the gap is too big for that. So something else that organizations can look at is, of course, cutting back the outgoings. So not looking at the income side, but just being more efficient, being smaller maybe. What options do you see are available for NGOs to make changes in their own operations? Yeah, Jim?
Yeah, I mean, I guess this is where I feel I would have something to add a bit more than on the previous two questions you asked, Constantin. I think we've got to engage with the scale of the problem that we're facing, and Jean provided some incredibly sobering statistics. I've got as I said, a bit more anecdotal evidence, but I don't see the funding that has disappeared from USAID and the other foreign aid programs being replaced. I do see the potential for private philanthropy to snap back to where it was after a period of strategic reflection or pause or whatever euphemism the foundations want to use. So there's a potential for that to spring back, but I don't think it will compensate for the funding that's disappeared from the ODA stream. And in that reality, the future means that there simply will not be sufficient funding to sustain all of the organizations in our respective sectors. And so I think it's incumbent on leaders within the sector to start coming together and talking about what does a pretty radically reduced sector look like, and how do we work together to safeguard what has been achieved, to maximize what can be done in future, and to look at collaboration, innovation, cost cutting. But I do think that part of the response has to lie in much more deliberate collaboration, partnership, moving all the way towards merger, in an environment where where it seems to me inevitable that there will be fewer organizations. Then I think it's incumbent on those of us in leadership positions to engage with that proactively, early and openly with one another, and talk about what does a reduced sector look like, and what are the key features. And that's going to be incredibly difficult, because the way that the funding environment is structured is it puts organizations which work on similar issues in direct competition with one another to bid for funds. And so we everyone talks about collaboration, but in reality, collaboration is very, very difficult outside of specific projects where there is a mutual benefit in coming together to bid for funding. The reality is most organizations see themselves in competition with others for the same pots of funding. All organizations by their nature are mission focused and believe rightly in almost every case that they have a unique role to play and a unique contribution to make. So why would they merge with anybody else? But I do think that has to be part of the response, together, frankly, with everyone in the sector making more noise about what is happening. And I think that there is a role for the legal community there simply as an ally in this fight. It's great to see law firms coming on board to do immediate legal challenges to contract terminations and so on. But that is, let's be honest, that's about safeguarding resources that were already secured under contract, not about what the future looks like. So I think after this kind of immediate, and it's been remarkable to see some of the immediate response, it's been really, really impressive. But I think everyone now needs to look up, what does the 1, 2, 3 year time horizon look like, and what does a radically reduced funding pot for everyone, what is that going to look like? Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. You want to respond to that, Jane?
Yeah, so one of the things that we found, and this sort of links to what Jim was saying, one of the things that we found, obviously, from this terrible data was that there were a number of organizations that either wanted to close down or needed to close down, but weren't sure how to do that. And also didn't have the resources to do that, because actually that's quite expensive, to do it well, to keep your information alive, to be able to make sure that the work lives through, that the learning lives through. You don't want to be in a situation where everything you've been doing for the last 15 years just disappears into the ether because you just had to switch off computers and leave. That is also a legal process. So I think just, as an aside, the other thing that people wanted to do was merge or create strategic partnerships with others. The strategic partnership process is enormously complex, particularly if you're in different jurisdictions. And even if you're in the same jurisdiction, mergers and acquisitions within nonprofits have a very different sort of motivation to mergers and acquisitions within the for-profit sector. And I think that what we need, and I think when we were sort of navigating this process and organizations said to us, hey, how would we even go about it? We don't even know what we don't know. We don't know what questions to ask. We were in a situation where we were like, okay, well, who can we call? What do we do? And there is a lack of resources around that. The other thing that we also found is that some organizations actually have weathered this very well, and they are in a sector that has been fine. And they said, well, maybe we could bring on other organizations or take on other organizations or sort of bring other organizations under our wing. So The lab, along with a couple of other organizations, have created a shared fund with support about 6 donors so far. It's about $1 million to support organizational partnerships, to provide technical support across contexts, jurisdictions. This could be legal support, human resources, organizational change management issues. And we have a team that is there to triage and matchmake and accompany people through the process. What we found is that, like, trying to find a lawyer to help one organization with only 5 or 6 hours of support is really expensive. Whereas if we could buy sort of 25, 50 hours of a lawyer in Kenya, it's time, and we sort of can have 5 or 6 different organizations using that support, then, that's sort of a much more effective way of managing it. And we can get better and faster support for people who just don't have time. Many people are sort of against the wire. They need to close now. They need to merge now. I think in terms of closing, we have, again, some money for organizations to be able to tap into around how can they save their data better, how can they preserve their resources for future, how can they get the right legal support to make sure that their organization is closed in a way that doesn't create additional liabilities in the future. And so it's called Civic Strength Partners. We have a website that you can link to. It's civicstrengthpartners.org. We'll send this around. There's also a 2-pager with some information on what we do. And so please do get in touch. There's I'm not sure if I can actually type anything here, but please do get in touch. We can send everyone the link. And if you do need help or you're wanting to think about this is definitely something we can do.
Thank you, Jean. And I think Eugene and Jim, in your last 2 statements, you've answered my last question which related to what roles individual lawyers can do in this environment, can take up. And we've heard that they can, join organizations as in governance roles, for instance, or also that they just pick up cases for groups of NGOs, of individual NGOs, get more expertise to be able to advise better and also to plan ahead of time. I think that is a very important point. With that, I also want to give the audience some room. And in the meantime, we have a couple of questions from the audience, which I will read out now. The first one is for you, Jim, from Cynthia De Santis. Thanks for the question. So the question is, thanks for the conversation, very sobering. We are a small NGO in the UK, healing Venezuela, and are considering different options, including leaving the organization dormant. Could it be possible for yours too?
Thanks very much for the question. I mean, yes, in principle, the process that we've initiated is, firstly, so as a charity, as an NGO in the United Kingdom, you need to be registered as both a charity and a company. And we have initiated the process of closing the company down, which essentially means completing all of our projects, bringing all of our financial activity to an end. So receiving all the remaining income and paying all of our partners, collaborators, contractors, and so on, and then entering a period of dormancy, after which the company will cease to be a registered legal entity. We took the view that the best way to take forward the mission of the organization was not to enter to make the organization dormant, but instead to find ways that others could take forward our work. So We, back at the beginning of 2020, began a partnership with the UN Human Rights Office, which has grown and flourished over the years to a point where now that office has as one of its primary objectives supporting the adoption of comprehensive equality laws, which is our number one, that's our kind of the core of our mission. And so we've taken the view that the best way to take forward our mission has been to support the UN in doing that, to work with partners who we've worked with on issues such as corruption, equality bodies, the rights of older persons, to support them with to transfer the resources that we've developed together with them to them, and then to find an online home for all of the resources that we've produced over the course of the last 15 years. And we're in the process now of what we've called our legacy program, which will take place over the next 3 months, of setting all of that up and transferring resources, making things available, connecting our partners to each other, signposting, and in so doing, we hope, as far as possible, finding a way for the work to continue without the organisation. I think that was my view and the view of the trustees, that ultimately, you know, a mission-focused organisation, the mission takes precedence over the organisation, and you have to find a way to safeguard that, while obviously looking after the staff to the best extent that one can. But we thought the best way forward was to focus on how do we find a way to sustain the mission even without the organisation, and we hope that we'll be able to do that. Thanks for the question, though.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Next question is from Shyamala Gomez from the Center for Equality and Justice in Sri Lanka. Thank you, Shyamala, for the question. We have tried reaching out to the corporates. We find they don't value the expertise in the NGO sector and tend to offer very little money for such expertise. Any thoughts on this from the panel? James?
Yeah, I've found this is a really interesting point. As I say, the ability to start charging consultation fees varies massively for the organization and for the geographic area and everything. One particular thing I found is that there's a bit of a disconnect between how corporations think of the money they're investing and how NGOs are used to dealing with the kind of funds and grants which come in. And I think the key area of the issue there is like the return on investment idea. I think that a lot of corporations are when they look at a charity, they aren't thinking in terms of just, you know, donating money, and it kind of goes into the overall work. They are starting to think, right, what's the specific, what am I getting out of this? And that's obviously even more so if you're looking at becoming a client for like a consultation service. And that is just there's a huge variation of approaches to that. You've got some organizations who see, especially in terms of environmental and sustainability stuff, they see that this is a long-term investment for them. By making their processes sustainable, they're not just doing good for the country, doing good for the world, but they're also making sure that they have the resources they need to continue in the long term, which is a really key payoff. But you have other, especially geographical regions where that hasn't sunk in yet, where it's still a focus on, you know, how are we going to do growth next quarter, how are we going to do growth next year, and so the sacrifices made for sustainability in the long term still isn't valued high enough. So I'd say from my perspective, it's unfortunately a fact that by going into the kind of idea of the market and looking at return on investment side of it, there is the fact that the market just isn't ready for it yet, that people haven't realized how valuable this stuff is and come around to it in some places. So it's a case-by-case situation.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, James. And I see Jean and Jean that you both have something to add to this.
Jean, you go first. I've spoken too much already.
No, so have I. But I mean, I think just very quickly, trying to pivot to make your work marketable now, if you haven't done it before, it's too late. It takes years and years to build the relationships. It takes years and years to build the trust. It takes years and years to convert your own language to that which is the imperative and process of the for-profit world, neither being bad, neither being good. It's just different. And it just means that you have to change the way that you talk, change the way that your materials are presented, change your imperative. Nonprofits focus on process. For-profits are focused on outcome and the end game and impact and the last bit. So yes, of course, as nonprofits, we care about impact, but the process is also part of that. We have to change our financial systems. We've got to change the way that we charge. We've got to change the way that we count up our hours. We've got to change up what is work. And so if you haven't done that already, if you've not built those relationships, if you've not changed your own middle models, or at least added these lines to your model, now it's too late to rely on for-profit or corporates or consulting firms or others to make use of your skills. I'm not saying this is not too late for those of you that would like to embark on this, and it is a process. We have not got this right yet. We have one, maybe two small consulting money, but that is not money that is keeping us alive in any way, shape, or form, and will not for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, it's like speaking a different language, talking to corporates, and that requires some time and effort. But there is definitely an opportunity in there. I think with this, it's about time to wrap up. From my side, I want to thank the audience for the questions, but also, of course, my co-panelists for the really interesting and enriching discussion. And with that, I hand over to you, Yasmin.
So I'd like to start by saying thank you to all our incredible panelists for their excellent moderating, excellent work, and also to the moderator. I think this has been a very informative and meaningful discussion, and I'm sure all of you participating will agree. I'd also like to thank all of you who've joined us today and for the questions that you've asked, which are, I think, or at least demonstrate exactly how people are thinking and the concerns that people have. So what we've heard in the last 75 minutes is not just a discussion, I think it's a call to action. We've been reminded that we are living in a time when the stakes for development and have probably never been higher. We've heard how amazing organizations have taken decisions and are ceasing to be. Jim, on behalf of us all at A4ID, I want to say a heartfelt thank you to you and your magnificent team at Equal Rights Trust for your partnership over many years. Thank you for enabling us to participate in your incredibly important work and for sharing with us the opportunities to do something significant together. We wish you well during this very sad time. As we've heard, funding shortfalls, increased competitive environments, conflicts, climate disasters are no longer passing storms. They're the weather systems that we now operate in. And yet, what today's conversation has shown is that even in the face of immense pressures, there is hope. Hope that through ingenuity, collaboration, and courage, we can find a way through, because we have to find a way through. We've seen that legal support is a catalyst for transformation, helping organizations restructure, innovate, and survive when survival itself is in question. And that, for me, is perhaps the most powerful takeaway from today, that justice is not a distant ideal. It is something that we can create together through partnership. Each of us has a role to play, whether as a lawyer, a development professional, a funder, or a member of civil society, in ensuring that the world's most marginalized communities are not left behind. Today has reminded us that when we bring our strengths together, we are capable of extraordinary things. So as we close, I invite you to carry this energy forward, but with realism. If you're a lawyer, consider how your expertise might be used, not just to solve problems, but to reimagine what is possible. If you are a development professional, continue to be bold in seeking out legal partnerships that can strengthen your mission and expand your reach. and make those very difficult decisions. And for all of us, let us keep pushing for a world where law is not a privilege, but a pathway to dignity and opportunity for all. So thank you once again for joining us. I hope you leave today not just informed, but actually inspired, ready to play your part in unlocking the power of the law for development, answering those difficult questions. And we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar in the Justice Through Partnership series, which is tomorrow. And tomorrow's session will explore partnerships for justice, equity, and sustainable progress in Africa. So finally, let's keep building together and the just and equitable world, which we actually all know is possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Yasmin, for this very positive end note to this great conversation. And if I could just add one last thing on that, sorry, on the organizational side, there is a survey prepared for you from Advocates for International Development. If you could fill out that survey, that would be really much appreciated. Yeah, with that, thank you also from my side. And yeah, have a great day, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.